My name is Daniel Whitmore. I'm 56 years old, born and raised in the Midwest, and for most of my life I believed I had figured things out. Not in a loud or arrogant way. I wasn't chasing fame or trying to be extraordinary. I simply trusted what I could see, measure, and explain. Facts, records, timelines, history. That was my world. I spent decades studying the British monarchy, especially the long reign of one queen whose life seemed to stretch across nearly a century of human history. Wars, cultural revolutions, political upheavals, she was there through all of it. Steady, composed, almost timeless. What began as a harmless fascination during my college years slowly turned into a profession. I wrote books. I lectured at universities. I traveled across the country giving talks to rooms full of people eager to hear about crowns, ceremonies, and the weight of power passed down through generations. History gave me structure when my personal life had none. Growing up, my home was loud, fractured, unpredictable. Books were quiet, orderly, honest. The past didn't shout back at you. It waited patiently to be understood. And so I poured myself into it. Somewhere along the way I told myself that history was enough. That if you studied humanity long enough, its triumphs and failures, its kings and revolutions, you didn't need anything beyond that. Certainly not faith. I grew up going to church. My parents insisted. Sunday mornings, stiff clothes, wooden pews. I memorized verses without really understanding them. Back then, God felt distant but familiar, like a relative you saw once a year and never really spoke to. By the time my career took off, that distance became permanent. I didn't reject God angrily. I simply outgrew him. Or so I thought. Faith became an idea I respected academically but never felt personally. Something meaningful for others. Not for me. If you had asked me what gave my life purpose, I would have answered without hesitation. My work. My research. Teaching people how the past shaped the present. I believed that understanding power, legacy, and leadership was the closest thing to truth we had. I admired figures who carried enormous responsibility. People who stood at the center of history and endured. I told myself there was something noble in that kind of life. Something almost sacred. Looking back now, I realize how ironic that was. I studied coronations, cathedrals, and religious symbolism for a living, yet I never asked myself what any of it pointed toward. I analyzed faith the way you analyze architecture, appreciating its design without ever stepping inside. There were moments, of course, quiet ones. Late at night after a lecture, alone in a hotel room, when the applause had faded and the room felt too silent. A hollow feeling would surface. Briefly. Uncomfortably. I learned how to push it down. I told myself that doubt was just fatigue. That meaning was something you built, not something you received. That prayer was unnecessary when you had reason and discipline. And for a long time that belief seemed to work. I had a reputation, a career, a sense of identity. I knew who I was, a scholar, a teacher, a man grounded in reality. What I didn't know was how fragile that certainty really was. Because there comes a moment in every life, whether we're ready for it or not, when all explanations fail. When knowledge falls silent. When the questions you've avoided for decades finally demand an answer. I didn't know it then, but I was already walking toward that moment. And it was closer than I ever imagined. The night it happened felt ordinary in every possible way. I had just finished another lecture. Another packed room. Another polite round of applause. I answered the usual questions, signed a few books, shook a few hands. The same routine I had repeated hundreds of times before. Outside, rain fell steadily, coating the pavement in a thin, reflective sheen. The kind of rain you barely register anymore once you've lived with it long enough. I remember getting into my car, adjusting the radio, and thinking about nothing in particular. I don't remember the crash. Not the sound. Not the impact. Not the moment metal met metal. What I remember is the sudden absence of control. One moment I was driving, following familiar roads, thinking about the drive home. The next, there was only confusion. Flashing lights, distorted shapes, voices that sounded far away as if spoken underwater. Later, I was told my heart stopped twice before I reached the hospital. Twice. The paramedics said my pulse disappeared on the way. They didn't expect me to survive the second time. One of them even admitted he thought he was just keeping me alive long enough to deliver a body. I was unconscious for most of it, but whatever was happening inside me felt painfully real. There was a sensation, not quite pain, not quite fear, but a heaviness. As if something essential was slipping away. Not my body. Something deeper. I became aware of a vast stillness, stretching far beyond anything I could comprehend. It wasn't peaceful. It wasn't comforting. It was immense and indifferent, like standing at the edge of an endless drop and realizing there was nothing beneath your feet. Time didn't behave the way it does in the waking world. Seconds felt like minutes. Minutes felt like lifetimes. I wasn't moving, yet I felt myself drifting. And in that drifting, a terrifying clarity settled in. All the things I had built my life around, my career, my reputation, my work, suddenly felt impossibly small, fragile, temporary. I saw my lectures as echoes fading in empty rooms. My books as ink on paper slowly turning to dust. Years of study reduced to footnotes that no one would remember. It wasn't regret exactly. It was something colder. Futility. I had spent my life studying the lives of powerful people, convinced that understanding them would somehow give my own life meaning. But there, suspended between breath and silence, I understood something I had never allowed myself to face. None of it could follow me where I was going. There were no titles, no credentials, no audience, just me. And I wasn't ready. A thought surfaced, uninvited, sharp, undeniable. What if this is it? What if all my certainty had been misplaced? What if the questions I had dismissed weren't philosophical curiosities, but warnings? For the first time in my life I felt exposed, stripped of explanations, alone with a soul I had barely acknowledged. I tried to reach for something familiar, a fact, a theory, a timeline. Nothing came. Instead, fragments from childhood surfaced, half-forgotten verses, words spoken decades ago that I had never truly listened to. They returned not as comfort but as accusation. What does it profit a man, a voice seemed to whisper, to gain the whole world and lose his soul? I had quoted scripture in lectures before, as historical context, as cultural influence. Never like this. Now it felt personal. Now it felt final. As my heart stopped again, whatever held me to the physical world loosened further. I sensed myself tipping forward, crossing a threshold I could not undo. And standing there, on the edge of something vast and irreversible, I realized the truth I had spent a lifetime avoiding. Knowledge had carried me far. But it could not carry me through this. There is a moment, I don't know how else to describe it, when fear stops being loud. It doesn't scream. It doesn't rush. It settles. That's where I found myself. Suspended in a place where sound felt distant and weight had no meaning, I became aware that I was no longer anchored the way I once was. My body felt irrelevant, like an object I had already set down and walked away from. What remained was consciousness. And beneath it, something far more uncomfortable. Awareness. I was aware of myself in a way I had never been before. Not as a professional identity. Not as a scholar or historian. But as something bare and unadorned. A soul. I had spent my life explaining the world without ever asking why I existed in it. I analyzed belief systems, religious movements, and sacred texts as products of their time. Human attempts to impose meaning on chaos. Now, standing on the edge of something that felt infinite, that explanation collapsed. There was no chaos here. There was order. And I was completely unprepared for it. I sensed a boundary, not a physical one, but a line that once crossed could not be uncrossed. Beyond it lay something final. Not necessarily violent. Not even dramatic. Just absolute. The realization terrified me more than the accident itself. I tried to tell myself this was hallucination. A dying brain misfiring. Chemicals. Trauma. I clung to those explanations the way a drowning man clings to debris. But deep down I knew that wasn't enough. Because hallucinations don't ask questions. And this place was full of them. Questions I had buried under years of certainty rose up all at once. Questions about purpose. About accountability. About whether my life had been anything more than an elaborate distraction. I thought of the countless hours I had spent studying crowns and thrones, convinced that proximity to power somehow gave life meaning. I remembered the pride I felt when my work was cited, when audiences praised my insight. And suddenly none of it mattered. It wasn't that my achievements were evil or wrong. It was worse than that. They were insufficient. I felt an overwhelming sense of exposure, as if every justification I had ever built was being quietly removed. One by one. Until there was nothing left between me and the truth. I had lived as though I were self-sufficient. As though understanding the world absolved me from answering to anything beyond it. But here, understanding was useless. There were no arguments to win. No conclusions to publish. Only a single, unavoidable reality. I was not in control. The thought struck me with unexpected force. I had prepared my entire life for everything except this. I had planned lectures years in advance. Mapped research projects down to the smallest detail. Anticipated questions before they were asked. But I had never prepared to meet God. The name surfaced in my mind with a weight I could no longer ignore. Not as an idea. Not as a cultural artifact. As presence. I felt smaller than I ever had before, not insignificant but measured. See? No. And with that awareness came shame. Not dramatic guilt. Not a list of specific failures. But a deep, aching realization that I had lived turned inward. That I had treated life as something to master rather than something to surrender. I had loved knowledge more than truth. And in that moment, standing at the edge of eternity, I understood the cost of that choice. There was no anger in what I sensed. No condemnation shouted from the darkness. Only silence. And the unbearable weight of what that silence meant. I hovered there, unable to move forward, unable to go back, aware that whatever happened next would define me forever. Then, slowly, something shifted. The stillness deepened. And the darkness began to take shape. The darkness was not empty. That was the first thing I understood. It had depth. Layers. Movement. It pressed in on me from every direction, not violently but deliberately, like a heavy fog that seeps into your lungs before you realize you're breathing it. I felt myself drifting downward, though there was no sense of falling. No wind. No speed. Just the growing certainty that I was entering a place where light did not belong. Shapes began to emerge, indistinct at first, like silhouettes behind thick glass. The closer I moved, the clearer they became. They were not monsters. They were people. Countless figures surrounded me, suspended in the same suffocating gloom. Their faces were etched with something far worse than pain. Resignation. Their eyes carried the weight of understanding that had come too late. A knowing that whatever opportunity they once had was gone forever. They did not scream. They did not beg. They simply existed in a state of endless regret. Their silence was deafening. As I drifted among them, I felt an overwhelming sense of recognition. Not because I knew them, but because I knew what they had lost. Oh, this place was not chaos. It was order without mercy. Consequence without appeal. Every illusion I had carried about neutrality vanished. There was no moral gray here. No academic distance. No observer's privilege. You were either aligned with truth, or separated from it. And separation had a weight. It pressed against my chest, tightening with every realization. I felt the full measure of my own choices settling over me, not as punishment imposed from outside, but as a natural outcome. I had lived as though postponement was harmless. As though faith could always be revisited later. As though God would wait politely at the edge of my life until I felt ready. Here there was no later. Here delay had a cost. I sensed memories surfacing, not random but precise. Moments when I had felt the quiet pull toward something greater and deliberately turned away. Times when prayer had crossed my mind and I dismissed it as sentimentality. When humility was offered and I chose self-sufficiency instead. Each memory added weight. Not crushing, clarifying. I realized with horrifying clarity that this place was not reserved for the worst of humanity. It was filled with the distracted, the accomplished, the intelligent. People who had lived respectable lives while quietly excluding God from them. People like me. A sound echoed through the darkness, faint at first like a distant bell. It did not come from above or below, but from somewhere ahead. It pulsed with a strange energy cutting through the stillness. The figures around me reacted. Some turned away. Others lowered their heads as if the sound itself caused pain. I felt drawn toward it. With every movement forward, the weight around me shifted. The darkness thinned just enough to reveal a faint glow ahead. Not bright. Not comforting. But undeniable. As I approached, a single figure began to take shape within the dim light. Tall. Upright. Distinct. There was something deeply unsettling about the familiarity I felt before I could even see her face. I knew who it was before she spoke. And that realization sent a tremor through me more powerful than any fear I had felt before. Because if she was here, then everything I thought I understood about power, legacy, and safety was wrong. The figure stepped forward. The shadows parted. And I found myself standing face to face with the very symbol of worldly permanence I had spent my life admiring. She stood before me, unmistakable even in the dimness. Not adorned in ceremony. No crown. No throne. No pageantry. And yet, her presence carried an undeniable gravity. I had seen her image thousands of times. In photographs, documentaries, archival footage. I had studied her posture, her expressions, the careful restraint that defined an entire era. But nothing prepared me for seeing her here. Her face was calm but not untouched. There was a weariness in her eyes, a depth shaped by decades of decisions that could never be undone. She looked human. stripped of distance, stripped of myth. Daniel Whitmore, she said. My name echoed in the darkness, spoken with a familiarity that made my chest tighten. Her voice was steady, dignified, yet softened by something I had never heard in it before. Regret. You have studied my life, she continued. You have examined my reign, my words, my image. But you never asked the question that mattered most. I tried to speak, but my voice felt foreign to me. Your Majesty. I never imagined. No, she interrupted gently. Neither did I. She looked past me, toward the shadows where the other figures lingered in silence. For most of my life the world saw stability, strength, duty. They saw a symbol that endured. What they did not see was the cost. She turned back to me, her gaze piercing in its honesty. Power demands devotion, she said. And it rarely tolerates rivals, not even God. Her words struck something deep within me. I believed my responsibilities were sacred, she continued. That serving the crown was synonymous with serving a higher purpose. And for a time I convinced myself that was enough. She paused as if choosing her words carefully. But duty can become a refuge. A way to avoid the stillness where faith is tested. I felt the parallel immediately. I told myself that history was my calling, I said quietly. That understanding the past was how I made sense of the world. I thought belief was unnecessary. She nodded slowly. Knowledge without surrender is a dangerous thing, she replied. It gives the illusion of control. She began to walk and I found myself moving beside her. The shadows parted just enough to reveal the faces of those around us. Listening, waiting. I lived among cathedrals, she said, her voice lowering. I stood beneath stained glass and spoke words of tradition and faith. Yet too often, my heart remained elsewhere. Her expression darkened. I placed my trust in continuity, in institutions, in the appearance of righteousness. I mistook ceremony for communion. The words settled heavily between us. In my later years, she continued, the wisdom of an ancient king haunted me. She turned to face me fully now. Solomon was granted understanding beyond any ruler before him. Riches, honor, influence. And yet, even he allowed the gifts to distract him from the giver. I had taught that story countless times. Never like this. He built temples, she said. Accumulated treasure. Expanded his kingdom. And still he strayed. Because faith cannot survive where it is treated as secondary. Her voice trembled slightly. I did not lose my faith overnight, she said. I misplaced it gradually. Beneath duty. Beneath protocol. Beneath the expectation that I must always appear composed. I felt an ache in my chest I couldn't explain. I thought my achievements defined me, she said. That my role excused my distance from God. But here none of that remains. She gestured toward the darkness. This place does not care who you were, she said softly. Only who you belong to. Silence enveloped us. I spent my life believing that if I carried my burdens well enough, they would justify everything else, she continued. But burdens do not save us. Faith does. I swallowed hard. I spent my life running from belief, I admitted. I thought understanding was enough. That prayer was for people who needed comfort. She met my gaze. And now, she asked. I hesitated. Now I see how empty that was. A faint, sorrowful smile crossed her face. The highest halls of power are often the loneliest, she said. And the emptiness at the top is unlike anything one can imagine. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. There are words I ignored for far too long. Words that could have guided me. She spoke them slowly, deliberately. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your paths. The darkness around us seemed to shift, as if responding to the truth of the words. I leaned on my own understanding, she said. And it failed me. Her eyes locked onto mine. You are standing where I once stood, she said. At a crossroads. You still have breath. You still have time. I felt something stir within me, fragile, unfamiliar. Oh, do not repeat my mistake, she said. Let your knowledge lead you back to God, not away from him. Pray. Surrender. Love him. Her voice softened. Earthly legacy fades. Titles dissolve. History forgets. But the soul endures. The shadows around us began to recede just slightly. Choose wisely, Daniel, she said. Because this moment will echo longer than any reign. Her figure began to grow faint, the light around her dimming. One day, she added, every crown is laid down. And with that she was gone. leaving me alone with the weight of her words and the choice before me. The silence she left behind was heavier than anything I had encountered before. Not empty, expectant. The darkness no longer pressed in the same way. It waited. I stood alone, suspended between what I had been and what I could still become. The words she spoke continued to echo, not as sound but as truth settling into place. Every crown is laid down. For the first time, I understood that faith was not an accessory to life, something to be added once everything else was in order. It was the foundation I had ignored while building everything on top of it. I felt the full weight of my resistance crumble. I had spent years insisting that belief required certainty, proof, evidence strong enough to satisfy my intellect. But here intellect offered nothing. Control was an illusion, and certainty was a luxury of the living. What remained was trust. I sensed, with painful clarity, that I was being given a choice, not imposed, not forced, but offered. To continue as I had been, clinging to myself, or to let go. The darkness around me seemed to respond to my hesitation, tightening just enough to remind me what refusal meant. This was not a threat. It was honesty. I thought of prayer, something I had avoided for most of my adult life. Not because I hated it, but because prayer requires humility. It demands that you admit you are not sufficient. And I had built my entire identity on the idea that I was. My thoughts slowed. The noise inside me finally quieted. I did not reach for eloquence. I did not search for the right words. There was no speech prepared, no formula to follow. Only honesty. God, I whispered. The word felt strange in my mouth. Heavy. Intimate. I don't know how to come to you. There was no response in the way I expected. No voice. No vision. But something shifted nonetheless. I spent my life avoiding you, I continued. I trusted myself, my mind, my work, and now I see how fragile all of that was. I felt exposed but not condemned. I don't have anything to offer you, I said. No defenses, no excuses, just what I am. The darkness thinned. I believe, I said, not with confidence but with surrender. Help my unbelief. It was the simplest prayer I had ever spoken. And the truest. Warmth began to spread through me, not dramatic or overwhelming but steady, reassuring. As if I were no longer drifting alone. I sensed love, not earned, not negotiated, not conditional. Given. For the first time, I understood that salvation was not found in achievement or understanding. It was found in turning toward God with an open heart. In prayer. In trust. In love. I had chased meaning through history, believing it lived in power and permanence. But meaning was never hidden in crowns or kingdoms. It was always here. Waiting. The darkness receded further, replaced by a gentle clarity. I felt myself being drawn upward, back toward something familiar. Back toward breath. Back toward time. As the weight lifted, a final thought settled deep within me, clear and unshakable. I had not been spared to return to the same life. I had been spared to begin again. The first thing I noticed was the sound. A steady, rhythmic beeping, slow and insistent, cutting through the haze. At first, I thought it was part of the darkness. Another echo, another illusion. But then came sensation. Wait. Breath. Pain. I opened my eyes to harsh white light and the sterile smell of disinfectant. A hospital room. Machines. Tubes. Reality pressing itself back into place. I was alive. The doctor later told me how close it had been. How my heart had stopped more than once. How they almost lost me. I listened politely, nodding, but his words felt distant. Because something far greater than survival had already happened. As I lay there, weak and disoriented, the memory returned with startling clarity. Not like a dream that fades upon waking, but like a truth etched into me. Her words. Her warning. Her regret. The weight of it all settled over me not as fear but as resolve. For the first time in decades, I reached for the Bible resting on the small table beside the bed. Someone must have placed it there, a nurse perhaps. Or maybe it had always been there, waiting. The pages felt thin beneath my fingers. Fragile. And yet, filled with more substance than everything I had ever written. I began with the words that now felt impossible to ignore. All is vanity. I had studied Ecclesiastes before, quoted it in lectures, analyzed its historical context. But now it spoke directly to me. Not as philosophy. As diagnosis. Days turned into weeks. My body healed slowly. My spirit faster. I prayed, awkwardly at first, simply, honestly, without performance, without pretense. I learned that prayer was not about saying the right things, but about showing up with a willing heart. I stopped trying to control the outcome. I started listening. The change was subtle but unmistakable. The emptiness that once followed me from lecture hall to hotel room began to loosen its grip. In its place grew something unfamiliar. Not the absence of questions, but the absence of fear. When I was discharged, I returned home to a life that looked the same on the surface. The same books, the same notes, the same shelves lined with history. But I was not the same man. I continued teaching, but my focus shifted. I no longer spoke of power as an end in itself. I no longer treated faith as a footnote. I spoke openly, carefully, humbly, about the limits of knowledge, about the danger of mistaking achievement for meaning. Eventually, I began sharing my story. Not to persuade, not to impress, but to testify. I told people what I had learned the hard way, that you can live a respectable, accomplished life and still miss the one thing that matters most. That salvation is not found in intellect, success, or legacy. It is found in faith, in prayer, in love for God. I watched as people listened, really listened. I saw the same questions flicker in their eyes that had once haunted me. Doubt, curiosity, longing. And I realized something profound. We are all standing at a crossroads whether we admit it or not. Every day we choose what we trust, what we worship, what we believe will save us. One day, every crown is laid down. Every title fades. Every achievement falls silent. But faith endures. If my story has taught me anything, it is this: it is never too late to turn back. Never too late to pray. Never too late to open your heart to God. I was given a second chance not to relive my old life, but to live a truer one. And if you are listening to this now, perhaps you are being offered the same invitation. Choose wisely. Because eternity is closer than we think. And grace is closer still.